Order, please. The Chair of the Committee of Whole House on Bills will report to the House.
That the Committee of the Whole House on Bills has made certain progress and begs leave to sit again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, in October, the province hired Bay Ferries to provide a ferry service between Yarmouth and the United States next year. Part of that agreement with Bay Ferries that they had 45 days to find a ship, Mr. Speaker, a vessel for that route. That 45-day period is now passed, but we have yet to hear from the government on the results, so I'd like to ask the Premier, has Bay Ferries secured a ship?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask the Minister of Transportation.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. It is an important one. We're very secure with the relationship we have with Bay Ferries and Mark MacDonald. There's a number of options he's looking at across the globe with respect to the shipping industry, the cruise ferry industry, and what's available for vessels. There is a number of leads. There's nothing confirmed at this point. Mark's working very diligently. He's our person. Bay Ferries is our operator for 2016 and beyond. We're very confident in that relationship, have the full support of Mark and vice versa, and we know we're going to get this done and do a real good job. Thanks so much.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that answer. The concern, Mr. Speaker, is that after spending $40 million plus on the previous provider, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have seen that when it gets so late in the year, it makes it harder for next year's provider to actually properly market the route and to take ticket sales, Mr. Speaker, and it really puts them behind the 8 ball when they try and get up and running in the spring, Mr. Speaker. So that is now that it's in mid-December, a concern that is being raised again. I'd like to ask the Premier, how late does the government feel this can go before it creates a problem for the 2016 season?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for the question. As the Minister just spoke about, we have a partnership with Bay Ferries. They have a long history in this province of operating ferries. They were actually the operator of that ferry service until it was terminated back in 2009-10. And we're, as the Minister said, we're very confident with the fact that they will have a service in place and that that service will be marketed in an appropriate way, and we will continue to welcome our visitors.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, for the people in Yarmouth and along the southwest Nova part of the province who are trying to make decisions about accommodations, restaurants, tourist attractions, they need to know, Mr. Speaker, whether there's going to be a service next year. For Nova Scotians who have carried a pretty hefty $40 million bill in the last couple of seasons because ferry services were not confirmed in time to properly give the route a chance, Mr. Speaker, people are concerned. The Premier is assuring the Nova Scotians that there will be a service next year, but I think it's reasonable to know what is the date by which, if we get beyond, it will be too late to have a fair ferry service for 2016.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Indeed, the people of southwestern Nova Scotia, indeed all Nova Scotians, know this government will deliver on providing them a sustainable long-term ferry service.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday evening, Robert Tupper, a man with hearing and vision loss who needs an interpreter to help communicate, was denied an opportunity to speak at law amendments. Even though there was still 25 minutes remaining and no other presenters were scheduled, Mr. Speaker, 5 members of the Liberal caucus voted against giving him 10 minutes to make his presentation. Afterwards, Mr. Tupper told reporters, and I quote, "There was no respect paid to me in regards to my disability from the Liberal caucus." So my question to the Premier, why did 5 members of his Liberal caucus deny Mr. Tupper the respect he deserves by not allowing him to speak at law amendments?
The Honourable Premier. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As I said in the last question period a few hours ago, Mr. Speaker, it was unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, as the way that committee ended. This started the night before when law amendments were on. It was brought to our attention. There was a Nova Scotian with hearing impairment who wanted to make a presentation. We found an interpreter. We told the NDP caucus that repeatedly during the day yesterday. They chose not to register the man and bring him here to the last hour. Mr. Speaker, he's here in time. We should have made the presentation, Mr. Speaker, but as I said to you, I will reach to you as the Speaker of this House that we see this opportunity as a learning experience, and we make sure that people with disabilities see every community in this province is one they can participate in, and we need to look at how we make sure that happens.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the 12 years I've been here, I don't recall ever having to bring someone as a caucus member to law amendments. Mr. Tupper tried to make those arrangements. All Nova Scotians have the right to speak at law amendments. Mr. Tupper made several attempts to exercise his rights. Mr. Speaker, denying a resident of Nova Scotia a chance to present at law amendments is no different than preventing a member of this House from speaking on a bill for second reading, or stopping the Premier from providing a response and question period. There are traditions members of this House are bound to uphold, and unfortunately, Mr. Tupper wasn't. In Mr. Tupper's case, that wasn't the case, Mr. Speaker. And to put it in his own words, I feel not part of this process, and I've had no voice in this process. So I'd like to ask the Premier, what justification did the 5 members of his caucus provide the Premier for not allowing Mr. Tupper to speak?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As I said to you and to all members of this House on a number of occasions, Mr. Speaker, this is an opportunity for us to look at all the committees that we have to ensure that, in Mr. Tupper's words, he didn't feel part of this process. Every Nova Scotian should feel part of this process. Look at how do we make sure we improve the process to allow people with disabilities to be able to participate, and we'll continue to do so.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
2 months ago, the Premier defended the member from Dartmouth East after he invoked privilege to avoid testifying in court. 1 month ago, the Premier defended his Chief of Staff after he was caught on tape offering the wife of a Liberal MLA a job in exchange for him being a good soldier, Mr. Speaker. And tonight, the Premier is really defending the 5 members of his Liberal caucus for not giving the right for Mr. Tupper to present, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the Premier, why will he defend the bad behaviour of his MLAs and staff, but not defend the rights of Nova Scotian residents to testify and give a presentation at law amendments?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I think as we talked about here, the opportunity will be provided tomorrow for the member to make presentation law amendments. Mr. Speaker, I have a chance to have the bill amended, Mr. Speaker, as we go forward. We'll continue to look at the processes of this House to make sure they're accessible to all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. So far this year, Mr. Speaker, the government has managed to take its budget from a deficit of $98 million up to over $240 million, Mr. Speaker, as tax revenues have declined. Now there's another threat to the provincial treasury, Mr. Speaker, and it's the new federal Liberal government in Ottawa. According to their own update released earlier this week, they said, and I quote directly, the new federal government is committed to making changes to the Universal Child Care Benefit Program that could have a negative impact on provincial revenues in the 2015-16 fiscal year if implemented in 2016, which is what the federal Liberals promised. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier, how much revenue are we expected to lose here in Nova Scotia next year because of the new federal government?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all members for the question. Again, I want to congratulate the national government. I'm looking forward to continue to work with them to make sure that the Federation of Canada is strong and Nova Scotia is a participating partner in that. The Minister of Finance will be meeting with his colleagues from across Canada and the National Finance Minister in the coming weeks. I think in sometime in mid-January, the whole issue, not only that issue, but a number of issues will be addressed. Mr. Speaker, we'll find a way to make sure that any changes the national government makes to tax policy or other policies, that this government will stand up and defend the rights of Nova Scotia and ensure that we mitigate any reduction that may be there.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. At some point, the congratulations to the new government will come to an end, and defending Nova Scotia and the benefits and the programs that we're entitled to in this country will have to start. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Premier will make sure that they know how we feel, but waiting until some future day is not an option, as these decisions are being made now. Mr. Speaker, the government is concerned about declining tax revenues and the jobs that go with it, Mr. Speaker. Here is a case where a decision in Ottawa may actually cause declining revenues in the next budget. So I'd like to ask the Premier, will he communicate to the federal government now that he intends to stand up for the benefits and the transfers that come to Nova Scotia, because we can't afford to lose any more revenue?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure him that this Minister of Finance and all members of this caucus, Mr. Speaker, are defending the interests of Nova Scotians, and he can rest assured that any changes the national government has talked about is communicated directly, quickly to them, the impact it have in this province, and this one is no different.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is to the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, Monday, during the budget forecast update, we learned that provincial revenue from personal income tax is projected to be more than $18 million less than what was originally estimated in the last budget. My question to the Minister, can the Minister explain why forecasted revenue from personal income tax has fallen so short of government's original projection?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I appreciate the opportunity to explain a bit about how these forecasts actually get created. First and foremost, the budget process and the forecasts are forward-looking, Mr. Speaker. That means that we don't have the actual data until after the events take place. So we're trying to forecast into the future, Mr. Speaker, a difficult process. We do so by using the most accurate and current data that we have at the point in time, Mr. Speaker. With respect to income tax data, Mr. Speaker, and the data for assessing that, we're integrated with the federal government, Mr. Speaker, and we rely on the data that comes from them, Mr. Speaker. That data has been updated, and that data change is what resulted in the new information.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when asked during the technical briefing, the department's own spokesperson said the significant drop in revenue is almost entirely due to a stagnation in wages, a problem that we know has the added disadvantage of reducing spending at local shops and small businesses. So my question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, if the department's own information is saying that provincial revenues are largely in the red because of wage restraint, why does the government think that further cuts would do anything but make the problem they've created even worse?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd just like to clarify for the member opposite. She concluded asking about why cuts would make this any better, Mr. Speaker. I believe the question, the area she's referring to, has no reference to cuts at all, Mr. Speaker. In fact, if she's referring to or insinuating anything about Bill 148, Mr. Speaker, that in fact includes $150 million of new money available for wage increases, Mr. Speaker. With respect to Mr. Speaker, the information is because of a decline in the overall economy, something that Nova Scotia is not immune to, Mr. Speaker. And with respect to public sector wage increases, Mr. Speaker, we have to pay 100% of those expenses, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Inverness.
My question is for the Premier. We have heard the Minister of Health say that the government has to look at how much a tax credit for farmers to give donations of food to food banks would cost before the government would look further at this idea. Mr. Speaker, that highlights the lack of economic insight in this government's Department of Health. Does the Premier agree that there will be a cost savings to the health system because people who face socioeconomic challenges will get to eat food that is local, healthier and more fresh, resulting in less chronic disease, better health outcomes, and lower costs, Mr. Speaker, for our health care system?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I encourage all Nova Scotians to eat local food, Mr. Speaker. It's what the Minister is referring to and what's been talked about in this House. That bill has gone to the Department of Finance to see what the impact would be on to provide that credit, and in actual fact, whether that credit would actually change what's happening now. Farmers are actually contributing a substantial amount of money to food banks, Mr. Speaker, and we are grateful for the work that they've been doing. We're grateful for what all Nova Scotians do in response to those Nova Scotians need. And when a good piece of legislation comes forward, we'll have a look at it and identify whether or not we can implement it.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is true. Certainly farmers are donating now, but I know in Ontario, in that case, there's over 1 million litres of milk was donated last year, just because of additional milk donated because of the implementation of the tax credit there. Feed Nova Scotia, the Federation of Agriculture, Young Farmers Forum, they're all supportive of this idea. The only question I have remaining, Mr. Speaker, is the reason the Premier and his government refused to advance the idea to increase the amount of local produce, especially at food banks, A, because it has not been a priority for his government 2 years into its mandate, or B, because they don't like ideas when they come from other sides of this legislature, even when those ideas are proven to help people, Mr. Speaker, as is proven with Ontario food banks since they've implemented this measure.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I'm assuming someone else has written that question for him, Mr. Speaker, because he knows very well, Mr. Speaker, that that's not the case. It's an idea that we brought forward. We said we would address it. We go look forward. We'll have a look at it, Mr. Speaker. We've passed bills in this House that have come from the other side of those. And Mr. Speaker, whenever I see a good idea come from that side of the House, we're often surprised. So it takes us a little while, Mr. Speaker, to get it to the Department to review it.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have a whole bunch to say to that last thing, but I'm not going to. The Provincial Health Authority released updated medical staff bylaws earlier this year. I think they came into force in April. The bylaws effect practice for all doctors, including family physicians. Some doctors have raised concerns that there is no consultation during the preparation of those bylaws. Meeting with doctors upon the introduction of these bylaws were largely negative, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister of Health, does he or his department believe that there was adequate stakeholder consultation when creating these new bylaws?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to say that we have continuous meetings with Doctors Nova Scotia, who represent all doctors in the province. We are one of those provinces where every doctor must be a member of Doctors Nova Scotia, and there is ongoing conversations on many issues, and this one was no exception.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
So we know now that doctors, of course, are licensed by the College of Physicians and Surgeons, but the District Health Authority is making them actually go through 2 licensing processes now, so they're actually duplicating the process because of these new bylaws. Under the new system, small practices are concerned that they'll no longer be able to grow. Some are being told that no new positions will be granted by the District Health Authority to walk-in or solo practices under the new credentialing practices. Can the Minister inform the House whether he is planning to reduce the use of walk-in clinics and limit the ability of small practices?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What we know in the department and what the Health Authority and the leadership there, and in fact Doctors Nova Scotia are strong proponents of the collaborative health practice, having that interdisciplinary approach to medicine is in fact a very, very strong practice. That will be the direction over a period of time. We're not closing walk-in clinics. One of the other areas that the member raises is solo practice. That is becoming extremely difficult to get a doctor now to go to a community as a solo practitioner. And in fact, the latest survey at the medical school indicates 100% of the students want to practice in a collaborative or team setting.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. In the Minister's economic update, he stated that provincial income tax is declining more than expected since the spring budget, and the Minister stated that sales tax has declined more than expected since the spring budget. We've also learned that there's been a sharp decline in both the number of movie and television productions filming in Nova Scotia and the number of Nova Scotia film jobs. My question is, how much of the decline in provincial income tax and sales tax revenue does the Minister attribute to the decline in the Nova Scotia film jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I also mentioned in the forecast update, Mr. Speaker, and in earlier questions earlier this week about that, where the challenge has come, Mr. Speaker, to our income tax revenue and, of course, sales tax revenue, Mr. Speaker, is related to an overall general economic and longer and sustained economic downturn that's affecting all parts of the country, Mr. Speaker. Recent fiscal updates from jurisdictions across the country, including the federal government, have shown downturns in many jurisdictions, even greater than Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Finance often talks about having a spending problem, but he must also consider his revenue problem. The film industry used to be worth over $100 million to the Nova Scotia economy. Can the Minister of Finance tell us how much his department forecasts the film industry to be worth in 2016?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the question, and with everything, again, forward-looking, the fiscal update that was provided yesterday was a fiscal update looking at the 2015 budget season, Mr. Speaker, updating for the quarter our December update based on data from the fall. Mr. Speaker, when it comes time to introduce the information for 2016, Mr. Speaker, that will be part of our 2016 budget, Mr. Speaker. We'll bring that information as part of that process. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also for the Minister of Finance. I just wanted to follow up on that question there. When the revenue estimates are down, it's not good enough just to say Canada is suffering, so therefore we're suffering. I would expect the Minister would try to dig through the numbers and figure out which parts are down. Has the Minister made no effort to figure out if the changes to the film tax credit are impacting the revenues of the province?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when what we've done with the film tax credit process, Mr. Speaker, when the budget came down, Mr. Speaker, there were a number of concerns raised, Mr. Speaker. The Department of Business has worked with, the government has worked with representatives from the film and TV sector, Mr. Speaker. They've developed a new fund, Mr. Speaker, that those groups agreed could work, Mr. Speaker. That fund has been available and accessible for a number of months now, Mr. Speaker, and my colleague, the Minister of Business, has been managing that through Nova Scotia Business Inc. And, Mr. Speaker, that's available for people. We encourage them to get out and apply. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's just so hard to believe that here we sit all these months later and the Minister would have you believe that there's a new fund, so going forward things will be good. Things haven't been good for the last little while. They've obviously impacted the revenues of the province, except for one person. The Minister of Business said he found one person who was bucking the trend. Obviously, the trend was downward. It's decreased the revenues of the province. Has the Minister not taken 1 second look to see what the impact on the revenues of the province has been? Is he satisfied to shuffle it off on somebody else or say it might go away in time with the new fund? We don't know. Maybe we don't care. On this side of the House, we care. Tell us what you know, Minister.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, the income tax data comes from, and the data that we get there, Mr. Speaker, is an integrated process with the federal government, Mr. Speaker. These are forecasts that we're looking forward-looking projections, Mr. Speaker. That data that we put into our economic forecasting models, Mr. Speaker, is updated based on the most recent and detailed information that we have available to us. We plug that data into the system, Mr. Speaker. These economic models are designed and tested, but again, Mr. Speaker, we base it on the data that we have. We got updated data, Mr. Speaker, and the results were presented earlier this week. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, and knowing we're down to a couple of question periods here, it's time to get a few local roads in. So, I want to get to Highway 3. Through the beautiful community of Argyll and Lower Argyll. It did make the 5-year plan, but it did mark it out to 2019 that the people of Argyll will have to wait for repaving of their road. Last winter wasn't very good to it, as it was to many roads in the province. So I'm just wondering, is there an opportunity to move it up the list depending on the acuity of that road?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I thank the member for the question. With respect to the route that the member is talking about, obviously, as I said many times in the House, there really is a lens that is focused on the local TIR officials, and I know that the member has a good relationship with Steve McIsaac and the officials that support Steve down in his region. Mr. Speaker, anytime there is changes and significant changes in highways, arteries and roadways that really do require repaving in a hurry vis-a-vis the capital plan, we certainly look at that. When roads are at a situation where they become urgent in nature and they have to be moved up the priority list, we get that recommendation from the local level. I'm sure the member will talk to his local staff at TIR and we'll make those adjustments accordingly for all Nova Scotians. Thanks.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Speaker. It's a very important road, as many roads are in this province. But I do want to mention two quick other ones while I have the opportunity, Mr. Speaker. One of them has to do with Southside and Cape Island, because that was due next year, so I'm hoping that's still on the list for some work. But what I really need from you, maybe, Mr. Speaker, I need from the Minister, is maybe a lawnmower, because the Route 308 through Morris Island has grass growing through it, and I think the locals are having trouble getting through. So could I maybe get a mower, or even better, could I get a little look on that road too, if you could instruct staff to look at it?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Obviously, the member is bringing these concerns forward on behalf of his constituents and the people in the region. Mr. Speaker, again, we do have a very solid process that we have in terms of using the local staff and making those recommendations. And Mr. Speaker, if he does need a mower, then it's a good time to add that to his Santa list. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister responsible for the status of women would know that women compose 66% and 84% of employees in education and health, respectively, and that women hold 66% of all public sector jobs in Nova Scotia. So, given that her government's fiscal plan will disproportionately impact women working in the public sector and their ability to provide shelter, food and clothing for their families, I'm very eager to hear about her influence in the plan. So, Mr. Speaker, what consultation was done with the Advisory Council on the Status of Women regarding her government's recent fiscal plan update? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. One thing I learned when I came into government was the fourth largest expenditure of government was $872 million for interest payments each month or each year. What I know is that that money doesn't help anybody in a classroom. It doesn't help anybody in a hospital. It certainly doesn't help any vulnerable people in my department. So when we have to get the ship righted in this province, that benefits all of us, including women, including children, including vulnerable people. So I absolutely am 100% supportive of the direction of this government in trying to maintain sustainability for the public service sector.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Well, thank you to the Minister for that response, and I'm afraid that won't really make anybody that is hurting in Nova Scotia feel any better, including the people who've lost their bus passes and had their income assistance frozen. Mr. Speaker, a paycheck is not just money in the bank. Wages influence choice, they decide career ventures, and wages also facilitate equity or widen inequality. So unfortunately, women in Nova Scotia experience a 33% pay equity gap, which means that for every dollar a man earns in a full-time, full-year job in our province, a woman earns 67 cents. So my question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister is, how can she justify freezing the wages of public sector workers, primarily women, when there already is a huge pay equity gap in Nova Scotia of 33%?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you. Public sector wages in Nova Scotia, across the board, women are represented very well, as you mentioned. One of the things that I find ironic about this line of questioning is the Status of Women office under your government actually lost close to $300,000 in funding over the 4 years. Yes, it did. And so I actually have, I know because I do the budget for that Status of Women office. Over the last couple of months, we've actually transferred all women-serving organizations over to the Status of Women. We have a gender analysis now going on that is starting from one part of the department to other parts of the department, and so I'm quite happy with the Status of Women office in Nova Scotia and what we're doing with equality in the public sector.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Business. Young women between the ages of 15 to 24 are having trouble finding work to justify staying in Nova Scotia. Over the last 5 years, their population has decreased by 4,400, their presence in our labour force has decreased by 3,900, and their employment has decreased by 4,000. Will the Minister explain to the young women in our province why they are not seeing any economic boost to encourage them to keep looking for employment in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. My colleague in advanced education is working diligently across all sectors and genders, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that Nova Scotians have equal opportunity. Yes, there's a challenge, there's a need. My colleague is working in that focus, intent on bringing those opportunities to the female population.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And without being double standard here, males aged 15 to 24 are also witnessing devastating economic environments here in Nova Scotia. Their population also has decreased by 4,200, and their labour force has decreased by 4,300. And lastly, their unemployment rate is now at 15.7. What does the Minister have to say to the young men who have lost hope in the government and chosen to leave our province in search for work?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated in previous question period, there are a number of initiatives ongoing within labour and advanced education, graduate to opportunities, particularly for the age group, Mr. Speaker. Our focus on junior achievements and the investment in students' time and interests at the high school level to gear them towards careers and professions that would desire them to stay and pursue careers in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of TIR. On June 11, 2014, the Deputy Minister of TIR appeared before the Public Accounts Committee saying that the Transportation Infrastructure Renewal will close any bridge or adjust posted weight limits if engineers feel that that bridge is unsafe. According to news reports, the bridge in Bear River has a crumbling concrete Arch, while 4 bridges in Cape Breton are listed in poor condition, including Highway 105 overpass in Sydney. So my question for the Minister is, what measure has the department taken to ensure that bridges in our province are safe?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. I did see that article. I am familiar with that particular bridge. I can assure the member, I can assure all Nova Scotians that the Department of Transportation, through our engineering measures and through our inspections, we don't let anyone, any vehicles, any pedestrians on bridges that aren't safe structurally. So that would never happen. In this case, in all cases, Mr. Speaker, we have a very vigilant and diligent department that looks at these things. The engineers go through every component of the structure to make sure that it's safe. Under no circumstances would we ever allow our bridge to be open if it wasn't safe. If there's weight challenges and concerns, then obviously those restrictions are put on there, Mr. Speaker. We've got over 4,300 bridges, and about 90% of them are structurally sound. Those that are concerned, we watch very closely, and we replace or repair as necessary. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for his answer. Mr. Speaker, about half of Nova Scotia's 4,100 bridges are past their expected 50-year lifespan. There is a concern for drivers and local residents who rely. This is a concern for drivers and local residents who rely on the bridges to get around their communities. So my question for the Minister is, how many bridges are being monitored, and are any in danger of being closed permanently because of the condition that they're in?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The short answer is that there's a regular maintenance check and inspection of all of our bridges that's done by the local engineers associated with each region. With respect to bridge closures, if you looked at just the metrics and the process that the department use over the next number of years, there are a relatively significant number of those bridges that could be slated for closure, but I can cite 2 quick examples: Cranton Bridge in Inverness and the St. Benoni Bridge in Digby. They were slated for closure based on the model that the department uses, but because of the response from the community, from the MLAs, from the people in that region that deem them necessary and say that the detour drive around isn't good enough, we made the commitment to respective communities that we would put the work in, make the investment, and keep those bridges open. Mr. Speaker, we don't want to close bridges if they're necessary, so when the community steps up, we make sure to protect that infrastructure. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia. Given the budget forecast update, one would think now more than ever the government would want to hold on to key sources of revenue. While revenue has declined in certain areas, the registry of motor vehicles bucked the trend and is forecast to increase revenues, bringing in over $127 million this year. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is, given the budget forecast update, why is the Minister still considering selling off a key source of government revenue?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for the question. As I've indicated on many occasions in the past, Mr. Speaker, there's been no decisions made with regards to alternate service delivery. We are exhausting all that we can do. We're exhausting, Mr. Speaker, the work that's necessary, because in the past, Mr. Speaker, when government had responsibilities in the best interest of Nova Scotians, they committed to contracts, Mr. Speaker, without doing the work necessary to make those decisions. There's no decisions made, Mr. Speaker, with regards to alternate service delivery. We would never relinquish revenue for the province that my colleague is suggesting. Any option for alternate service delivery would sustain and enhance revenues for the province.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, as I said in this House before, the land registries is a driver of economic development. One of the brightest spots in the budget forecast for residential construction, where there was an 11% increase. Yet there is concern that the cost of doing business in this sector will dramatically increase if the land registry is privatized. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is, why is he still considering privatizing the land registry when there is substantial evidence that the driver of economic growth in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. no decision has been made with regards to any of the registries. We continue to do the work necessary to make informed decisions that are based on evidence and in the best interest of Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, DSME is a manufacturer of large wind towers located in Pictou County. They continue to attempt to seek out new opportunities and strengthening their current business practices in order to build a strong future for the company. The question to the Minister, will the Minister give the members of this House an update of any recent meetings between his department and the management team at the windmill facility in Trenton?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. The Department of Business Government has representation on the board of DSME. They continue to meet, Mr. Speaker, consistent with the desires and efforts of this facility. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, their next monthly meeting is tomorrow morning.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, DSTN management are making efforts to diversify to be an integrated manufacturer of large-scale heavy steel products and a provider of EPC services for all aspects of the energy industry. They also have been attempting to secure contracts to build railway cars to transport oil. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister. Province of Nova Scotia has a 49% equity stake at this one-time Trenton Works railcar plant. Will the Department of Business make it a priority to assist this facility to secure steel contracts in order to bring employees back to the plant?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my colleague would know, the Department of Business is a policy centre that is intended to align the responsibilities of all government departments who have responsibilities for economic development. The area that my colleague is referencing is one area where we continue to engage by representation on the board the efforts of the particular facility, DSTN in Pictou County.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. In recent days, Mr. Speaker, it has come to our attention that two employees at the Labour Standards Office in Sydney, Patricia McNeil and Dave Genter, have retired, and as a result of that have not been replaced, and that office is closed. Could the Minister confirm if that is true?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and I'm not familiar with that particular situation, but I'd be most happy to get back to him at our earliest convenience.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate that the Minister will look into that situation. The office works with many different offices within the CBRM, and it is very important to have local people to be able to contact to do the work that is done. It is not satisfactory for the community for people to be told that they have to contact Halifax to get results for their answer. So I'm asking that the Minister will not only check into the situation, but make sure that there is an Office of Labour Standards open in the provincial building in Sydney.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure him that the folks in Halifax are perfectly capable of answering questions from Cape Breton Island. However, I do appreciate him bringing this concern to my attention, and I will make sure I will get back to him with an answer. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, at Law Amendments, we heard from Janet Hazelton, the president of the Nova Scotia Nurses Union. She spoke out against the government's pattern of bad faith bargaining, and she called it bargaining under duress. Given nurse morale is already low in the province, why is the Minister of Health in support of imposing contracts instead of allowing for fair arbitration?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to say that we look forward to the nurses arriving at the essential service legislation being completed by both parties. Then they will go into negotiations for their next contract, and we will certainly be receptive to how they see changing and improving their workplace in the coming years.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
She also noted in the 40 years that the Nurses Union has negotiated, Mr. Speaker, they haven't seen legislative package like we've seen with the bill in front of the House. Other nurses and healthcare workers spoke out at law amendments too, and they spoke about working conditions, they spoke about overtime, being short-staffed and being stretched too thin, Mr. Speaker. So why is the Minister of Health supporting a labour strategy that takes away the chance for fair arbitration from healthcare workers and does nothing, Mr. Speaker, to improve the working conditions?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's probably a good time with some of the challenges that we've had at the Centennial Building and VG to commend our nurses for the exceptional work that they do each and every day, how they responded to a couple of crises, how they responded to a couple of crises, and what we must realize is and take into account is the entire picture of healthcare delivery by nurses in the province. And I'm pleased to say, Mr. Speaker, that last year we attracted over 300 nurses to the province from other provinces and other countries to work in our province.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Home care is a very important service, both to people who are receiving it, but also to their loved ones who rely on home care to ensure their loved ones are looked after. I know the government has talked about home care and about possible changes made to it. I know I've met with workers working in home care. We see, especially in rural areas, we see situations where home care workers are not staying. They're not happy with the work environment. I've seen, certainly locally, home care workers who have been excellent workers who've just gotten tired of it. My concern, Mr. Speaker, or my question to the Minister is there's supposed to be some kind of consultation going on. What is happening with that?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and as the member opposite rightly described, it is challenging work, it's demanding work. Hours can be spread over an entire day. What is taking place is that we've now had an ongoing process since we first started to talk about the need for changing the delivery of home care in the province, and that work continues. Now we'll be moving very soon into contractual negotiations. All of the agencies that have been providing care in the province will be involved with that process.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I heard the government muse about creating a new category of home care worker, and I'm not sure. Maybe that would work in the city, but I know in a rural area it would be difficult to keep costs down by adding somebody else into the mix. In rural areas, there's a lot of travel between appointments. There's issues with roads, with weather. And needless to say, Mr. Speaker, one of the biggest problems with home care in rural areas is this focus on the direct service hour the department focuses on. And it's not consistent across the province and how that dollar figure is tabulated. And can the minister comment on that, if the government has taken a serious look at direct service hours to make sure it's fair for whatever organization is running home care in whatever jurisdiction across the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That, in fact, is a very considerable goal when the new contracts and the deliverables that will be required in that contract. In fact, fairness will be an exceptionally important part of that. Currently, we have 21 different contracts. They all have different components. The wages over those contracts range by as much as $23.07 from the lowest to the highest. Bringing fairness to those contracts will be one of the important ingredients going forward.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Labour. Earlier this evening, the Minister was asked what advice she had provided government regarding labour provision in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. She stated she wasn't a lawyer and so provided no advice. I would like to rephrase the question. And what information did the Minister of Labour's department provide to her government regarding the Charter of Rights and their current labour strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. There may have been some confusion, I think, around my particular qualifications when the question was asked earlier. I want to clarify for the particular member who asked earlier that I do have a degree in English and legal studies. However, the legal studies is in fact philosophy of law, etc. I am not a lawyer, so I want to be clear on that. I just want to be clear with the member who asked the question.
Order,
the member
please.
For
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now revert back to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that you do now leave the chair and that the House resolve itself into the Committee of the Whole on bills.
The House will now recess for a few minutes while it resolves itself into the Committee of the Whole House on bills.